Now you talk about terror. What about for me? I've been terrorized all my days. All my days.
Welcome to the Chris Hedges Report. On January 9th, 1966, the White Knights of the Mississippi Ku Klux Klan murdered the black civil rights activist Vernon Dahmer in Hedgesburg, Mississippi, after firebombing and shooting into his house. It was one of thousands of hate crimes conducted in the South by whites who waged a reign of terror against blacks to frighten them from abandoning calls for desegregation and voting rights. These attacks, including threats, beatings, shootings, and arson attacks on black churches, businesses, and homes. The few men charged with these crimes, including murder, were often acquitted by white juries. To this day, over 150 murders, 56 in Mississippi, remain unresolved. Terrorism by white vigilantes against religious and ethnic minorities is ingrained into the DNA of American society, going back to the slave patrols. Its face was on display in 2015 when Dylan Roof gunned down 9 members of a Bible study group in a black church in Charleston, South Carolina. It was on display 3 years later when 11 worshipers were murdered at a synagogue in Pittsburgh. It was on display when neo-Nazis marched in the streets of Charlottesville, Virginia. It was on display when Ahmaud Arbery was murdered on February 23, 2020 in Georgia. It was on display when neo-Confederates who stormed the Capitol on January 6, 2021. The FBI recorded 8,263 reported hate crimes in 2020, a 13% jump over 2019. What motivates these people? How do they look at the world? How do they justify to themselves and others these acts of terror? These questions are explored in the new book, When Evil Lived in Laurel, The White Knights and the Murder of Vernon Dahmer, by the former Boston Globe reporter Curtis Wilkie. Wilkie, relying on interviews with participants and meticulous records kept by Tom Landrum, who for 4 years worked as an FBI informant inside the Klan, provides a rare look into the inner workings of white hate, how its extensive network of law enforcement officials, politicians, state and city officials, journalists, preachers, and business leaders colluded in what became a decade of unrelenting terrorism in the South. Joining me to discuss his book, When Evil Lived in Laurel, The White Knights and the Murder of Vernon Dahmer, is Curtis Wilkie. So you write, many of the Klansmen felt wounded by society, poorly educated, ignorant of modern skills, and consigned to unrewarding jobs. They seethed over their own situations. They were, you say, mostly made up of resentful men who worked the small farms, oil fields, or logging camps, or held jobs on the line of Masonite, a monstrous factory that loomed over the landscape like a brutal force, converting wastewood into fiberboard. This resentment, you write, hardened into a hatred of the black man. Could you speak about this resentment, especially with so many in the white working class today, also in economic freefall?
Sure, it's kind of metastasized into hatred and violence. It certainly did here, as you say at the beginning. It's sort of thing we're still seeing. I suspect a lot of the people who were involved in January 6th a year ago would come from the same kind of economic straits.
And what is it about that economic deprivation that metastasizes into this racial violence?
Well, it's a terrible phenomenon that was certainly with us in Mississippi in the 1960s and manifested itself again outside the South today. Certainly involves demagogic political leaders who kind of whipped this up under the notion that they are populist, and to consider somebody like Donald Trump a populist is quite silly. The populist that I think of, and I think the classic definition of a populist is basically somebody who is coming out of the very situation we're talking about. Poor, sometimes uneducated, resentful, and lashing out at authority, leadership, law, and Donald Trump, comes from the antithesis of that kind of background, but he certainly, has been responsible, I think, for a great deal of the surge in this sort of thing over the last 5 or 6 years. It's like he reminds me so much of George Wallace 50, 60 years ago.
Yeah, I went back actually during the Trump campaign and listened to George Wallace speeches, and it was a very similar, uh, almost identical rhetoric, including Wallace's call for violence against his opponents.
Yeah, and the press. Wallace loved to used to press his foils and would single people out in his speeches. And the Wallace rallies just had this aura of incipient violence about them, which I never went to a Trump rally. I've happily been retired from journalism for a number of years, but it strikes me as the same sort of thing that we saw with Wallace when I was reporting and covering Wallace.
The difference, Curtis, is that Wallace was always a fringe figure, whereas Trump moved to the epicenter of American politics.
Yeah, to our distress.
Robert Paxton, in his book, The Anatomy of Fascism, writes that the Klan was America's earliest example of fascism. And this fascism is wrapped in racialized supremacy, the flag, the cross. And in your book, you write about how the Klan opened with a prayer. They would set up a kind of Klan altar at the meetings. They fined its members for cursing, which I found kind of ironic since they were all then going out to burn someone's house down. They burned crosses. They had chaplains. Its leaders quoted biblical verses to justify segregation and acts of violence. The leader of the Klan group you write about, a guy named Sam Bowers, was an exponent of what he called Christian militancy, was openly at war with the federal government that he said was in the control of atheists and Bolsheviks. The Klan members referred to themselves as redeemers who would restore Christian values, if need be, through violence to the nation. I wondered if you could address this religious component, especially given the connecting tissue among those who stormed the Capitol on January 6th and this kind of Christian fascism. Is it the same?
Well, it's a kind of perverse Christianity. I don't think it's the kind of thing that Jesus Christ would have been very comfortable with. Not only did you have these people using the Bible, I mean, the Bible was a prop at Klan meetings, and the Klansman who led the murderous raid on the Dahmer home was actually a minister himself, a fellow named Cliff Sessions, and he kind of self-ordained, but he was a minister. There were ministers involved in those horrific murders in Neshoba County, Mississippi, in the 1964. One of the ringleaders and the guy who orchestrated that. And Bowers, who you mentioned, who was the imperial wizard of this group, the White Knights, he has a lengthy interview that's in the state archives that I was able to locate, in which he just goes on and on about the Christian militancy. And one of the tenets is that homicide is acceptable if you do it with love, whatever. Just it's crazy.
The Klan members that you write about were often these kind of buffoonish figures. They espouse these wild conspiracy theories, very similar to groups such as QAnon. They gave themselves these odd assortment of official titles like Imperial Wizard uh, and Grand
Grand Dragon.
Cyclops. They had this sense of importance and empowerment within the group that the wider society denied them. I wanted you to talk about this aspect of the Klan and its attraction to these people.
Well, you're right at it there. It gave them this sense of authority that perhaps they'd never had. Suddenly they've been anointed, exalted class just uh, Grand Dragon, Imperial Wizard, silly stuff, kind of thing you would think children would do. But they loved that. They were looking for any kind of respectability that the Klan provided, and the Klan also provided it was camaraderie between these people. It was for some of them it was like belonging to a civic club, except their meetings were secret and involved pistols and knives and the Bible and the Confederate battle flag as props. It was very weird, and while we're talking about the poor, less educated people, the odd thing was that there were some allegedly respectable businessmen or public officials, some with college educations, who joined the Klan also. And I think that was largely driven out of racial hatred.
Well, throughout the book, you write about how these political figures essentially had to play to the Klan. They could not run afoul of the Klan uh, for fear of losing their elected position.
Yeah, in those days, there were plenty of counties in Mississippi where the Klan had controlled a very extensive voting bloc that could sway the outcome of elections. So, sure, these political people would pander to the Klan. There were plenty of instances. You mentioned at the outset these people who might have been indicted or brought to trial for some of the crimes and were never convicted, either hung juries or outright acquittals. Quite often, the public official in charge of drawing up the jury list, uh, they were members of the Klan themselves, so they made sure that there were fellow Klansmen on the jury list who would provide. All it needs is one person to hang a jury.
Well,
And
that was part of the goal. They always tried to put one Klansperson on the jury. One's Klan, they were men. One Klansman on the jury, and then the Klans people would never be convicted.
yeah, that happened repeatedly in Mississippi in the '60s, including the trials against not only Sam Bowers. He was brought to trial 4 or 5 times before he was finally convicted 32 years after the murder. But also another dreadful character named DeLay Beckwith, who assassinated Medgar Evers in Mississippi in 1963. So there were plenty of instances where there were hung juries, and these were two of the most significant civil rights trials held in Mississippi in the '60s. And during the '60s, they all wound up with hung juries. I think Beckwith was more than 30 years after the murder of Medgar Evers. It took before Beckwith was convicted. I think that was in 1994. And
So throughout your book, there's repeated examples of collusion between law enforcement, elected officials, and the Klan. The three civil rights workers, James Chaney, who was black, Michael Scherner, Andrew Goodman, both of whom were Jewish, and that's an element in the book, who were murdered in June 1964 in Philadelphia, Mississippi, had been turned over to the Klan by local law enforcement officials after they were stopped for a bogus traffic violation. Can you speak about these kind of interlocking systems of white supremacy and how they work?
well, it just existed in Mississippi at that time. It was more acceptable uh, in Mississippi in the 60s. Happily, much of that has changed. We still have racism in Mississippi. We still have attempts at suppressing voter registration and exercise of vote by blacks in Mississippi. But the climate that we had in the 60s, the time in which the book covers, it was widespread throughout the state, and it seeped into law enforcement. It operated at the highest levels. Quite often the governor, lieutenant governor, legislators, they were all sympathetic with the Ku Klux Klan. When those three young men disappeared in Neshoba County in '64, our U.S. senators said this is a hoax, that those boys have gone down to Cuba and they're probably enjoying a drink with Fidel Castro. And it was all a communist plot, when in fact they had been executed and buried in a forlorn part of Neshoba County. And it was only after the FBI had paid off some people who knew about it that their bodies were discovered. And I think, that particular incident, along with, say, the Dahmer murder, where they attacked his home in which he had three children living there and a wife, and burning the thing to a ground and succeeding in killing him. He stayed in the burning house in a gunfight with the attackers while the family escaped through back windows. The kind of people who would do that, they're depraved. And back at that time, these crimes were kind of brushed off by authorities. It was the kind of thing that worked during the battle to redeem ourselves. That's another great word that you mentioned. That all of this goes under the guise of being redeemers to recover control of the South after Reconstruction. So it's a great deal of resentment. That's that resentment in part grows out of Reconstruction. Uh, so it's a long history down here, and I wouldn't be living in Mississippi today if it were as bad or prevalent as it was back then. But sadly, there were, aside from the black communities in the South and a handful of whites, it was uh, generally accepted uh, as a fact of life.
So there are two heroes in your book. There's Tom Landrum, who at tremendous personal risk to himself and his family worked without pay for the FBI as an informant, and the courageous civil rights leader Vernon Dahmer. I wondered if you could speak about these two men.
Sure, Vernon Danbury was just a first class hero. He was a black man who had dared to be a leader in his region in South Mississippi on voter registration. He was the president of the NAACP chapter in Hattiesburg, which is, by Mississippi standards, a fairly substantial city. And he took great risk. He was threatened for several years before they finally struck with their fatal raid in January of 1966. So he knew that he was at risk with what he was doing. And I know I interviewed his widow before the final trial of ours, and she talked about how they alternated sleeping at night and always with guns by their bedside. And he might sleep for the first 4 or 5 hours of night, and then she would take over and sleep. So that's the kind of fear that that they had, and yet they were not intimidated. And so he was, a terribly brave man and a good man, and a true hero in the movement. Tom Landrum was a white man from the same region who was a youth court counselor. And happily, there were white people who were troubled by what was going on, but so often they didn't know where to turn to try to do good and to combat the Klan. So Landrum worked with the FBI as a youth court counselor. They would check out potential bad boys and that sort of thing. And the local FBI agent realized that Tom Landrum was troubled. And so he approached him and said, "Would you be willing to join the Klan and report regularly to us?" And so Tom Landrum went home. Tom Landrum also had a big family. He had a wife and 5 children at home, and talked to his wife, talked to his mother-in-law. They actually went on a retreat and prayed over whether he should take up this challenge from the FBI. And they all decided it was something he had a duty to do, in part as a good Christian. And Tom Landrum then did it without pay. There were a lot of informers during that period that the FBI paid. Tom Landrum got mileage, and I don't even think the FBI reimbursed him for the Klan uniform he had to buy. And he did it at great risk to himself. There was one incident near Natchez during the time that Landrum was in the Klan and informing, where a Klansman who was thought to be an informant was murdered by the White Knights. So Landrum also, like Vernon Dahmer, these were 2 people who risked their lives with small children within their family to try to do good. So I think you're right in characterizing both of them as heroes.
So I get about halfway through your book, and I think this is a good story about the FBI. And this is, of course, during COINTELPRO and everything else. And then you get to this moment where the FBI brings in this soldier from the Colombo crime family, Gregory Scarpa, and he's from New York, to intimidate and beat kidnapped Klan members to force them to talk. So I just want you to talk about those tactics, which are kind of familiar to those of us who follow the FBI, especially if you look at the history of the left or the Black Power movement.
Well, of course, one thing I don't want to do is totally aggrandize the FBI. They were helpful in Mississippi in the 60s, no thanks to J. Edgar Hoover, their director, who basically disliked the whole idea of the civil rights movement and despised Martin Luther King, and did everything he could to undermine Dr. King's efforts. And they were involved in a number of extra legal activities in Mississippi and elsewhere, as we both know. As I'm sure you have and I have, back when the COINTELPRO documents were all revealed, I think sometime in the 70s. It was quite amazing and frightening, some of the things that the FBI was involved in. In my book, there are basically two instances. One is for them to import this hitman from the mafia in New York, who is already working with the FBI. He's trying to beat a rap he's got in New York, and so they induce him to do dirty things for them. And there's one of the FBI people who had been sent to Mississippi, knew of Scarpa, and sent a request to the FBI in New York. Can you send us that part's redacted from the FBI document I have, but it's Gregory Scarpa. He fits the profile, and they sent him to Mississippi, and along with his girlfriend, and the FBI pays his airfare, his room, and he shows up at the business of a guy who is a ranking Klan member, and they kidnap him basically and drive him out in the country and beat the hell out of him and send him to the hospital. So intimidated him that he began turning over all sorts of information to the FBI. The second instance in my book is during a period when the white knights turned from blacks to begin attacking Jews in Mississippi. And they began bombing synagogues and the homes of prominent Jewish businessmen, as well as rabbis. And so when Jewish leaders met with the FBI, and they said, what can we do? Well, the FBI told them, well, give us money for this slush fund that we'll use for essentially illegal activity. And this particular slush fund that I wrote about was used in Meridian, Mississippi, to set up an ambush of a couple of Klansmen. It turns out one of the Klansmen was a young woman who were about to deliver a bomb to the home of a Jewish businessman. And did they attempt to arrest them? No. They unloaded on them with a SWAT team, and I think even some members of the military, local law enforcement, the FBI, and blew the hell out of this car, killed the young woman. It was an evil thing they were involved in, but it's highly extraordinary. No warning, no nothing. They stepped out of the car, and dozens of people unloaded on them.
I just want to close, Curtis, the last couple minutes, because one of the things that I found fascinating with your book is because of that inside account within the Klan, we really got a view into how these people think and why they think the way they do. And I want you to draw it to this particular moment, because we see a resurgence of this kind of, rabid nationalism and white supremacy in these kind of cult-like figures around Trump, and of course in the attacks on the Capitol on January 6th. And I just want you to kind of draw parallels between what you wrote about and where we are today.
Well, you see it in not necessarily the Ku Klux Klan anymore, but in these new groups that pop up, whether it's Proud Boys or, all these weird names they have for groups. It's generally not the work of one individual out as a single-minded assassin, but rather people who meet and get together and share their grievances and resentments and lash out. And we certainly saw it January 6th, but you've seen it in a number of other places, not just in the South today, but all around the country. It's the same sort of thing. It doesn't go by the Ku Klux Klan anymore, but they might as well.
And would you argue that it's driven by the same economic despair?
Sure, that's part of it, but that's not the only motivation. But that certainly is a major thing. So I was just downright hatred. Some of these people have money, and they just they don't like blacks, or they don't like liberals, or liberals are communist, and they fear that if not communism, something's going to take over America. It's crazy stuff, and it's it's helped along by right-wing radio talk shows, and sadly some television networks that play into this whole thing.
Great. That was Curtis Wilkie on When Evil Lived in Laurel, the White Knights and the Murder of Vernon Dahmer. I want to thank the Real News Network and its production team, Cameron Granadino, Adam Coley, Dwayne Gladden, and Kayla Rivera. You can find me at chrishedges.substack.com.